gentlemen who are participating in our roundtable tonight will speak in the following order. First will be Dr. Thomas Ungerleider, to my immediate right. Dr. Ungerleider is Assistant Professor of Psychiatry at UCLA Medical Center here in Los Angeles. He was formerly Chief of Psychiatry at the United States Army Hospital at Fort Ord, California. He published numerous articles on various subjects, including LSD. He is consultant to the California Attorney General on current problems in drug abuse in California. He's a permanent member of the Los Angeles County Medical Society's Public Information Committee on drug abuse problems. He's had articles appear in various medical journals. The second speaker will be Dr. William McGlothlin. Dr. McGlothlin was formerly with the RAND Corporation as a social scientist. He is at the University of California, Los Angeles now, as a psychologist, a research psychologist in the Institute of Government and Public Affairs. He has also been a research associate at the University of Southern California. He's a certified psychologist in the state of California and is principal investigator on an NIMH grant on surveying hallucinogenic drug use. This is over a 3 or 4 year period of time, a significant research project. Third speaker is Dr. Richard Alpert. Dr. Alpert was formerly an assistant professor at Harvard in the College of Education, Department of Social Relations, and assistant director of the Laboratory of Human Development. Our first speaker then, each speaker will give a short presentation, then we will open the discussion to the floor for questions from you folks. So our first speaker then will be Dr. Ungerleider.
Thank you and good evening. I'm supposed to give an opening statement of no longer than 20 minutes and in that length of time present the problems and the position of LSD as I see it. And I find that an extremely difficult thing to do. There has been so much written and aired about LSD, so much in the mass media, including a great deal of seductive publicity, that we're living in what I would call an age of LSD hysteria on both sides. For example, Dr. Fisher and I receive literature that all LSD use in this country is a communist plot. We receive letters that God will strike us dead for not recommending the use of LSD to everyone. LSD was a political issue in the recent California governor's race. We've heard it implicated in everything from police brutality to Vietnam. And in addition, the picture is a constantly changing one. For example, now it's becoming in vogue to claim LSD amnesia as a defense against robbery and in murder trials. As you probably know, the one legitimate manufacturer, Sandoz Laboratories, reacted to this hysteria by discontinuing the manufacture of LSD and turning over all existing supplies to the National Institute of Health. This had the effect essentially of making all LSD black market. And subsequently, many researchers left the field with the vital questions about this most powerful drug still unanswered. As you also probably know, the use among the population is increasing. Originally, LSD was used mainly by professionals, intellectuals, and artistic people. Now it's spread from the colleges to high schools, junior high schools, and all socioeconomic groups. Certainly a great deal is not known about LSD. There are a few things we do know, and perhaps tonight the panel can bring some of these things out. I'd like to comment briefly first on the legal situation. Federally, LSD has been illegal to produce for manufacture or distribution since 1965, and in addition, in California and subsequently approximately 10 other states, it's been illegal merely to possess LSD, which immediately brings up the question of enforcement. How can this be enforced? The police say they're not after the users, just the pushers, but how could you enforce an anti-possession law? For LSD is colorless, odorless, and tasteless. It can be placed on the back of an envelope or postage stamp or soaked into your suit or clothing, and you can take a trip, meaning have an experience, merely by licking the envelope or stamp or chewing on the coat or sweater. There's no chemical test for LSD once it's inside the body, and the equipment to test for it outside the body is expensive and not generally available to law enforcement. Secondly, I'd like to comment about the psychedelic or mind-manifesting aspects of LSD. And I think we'll probably be talking a great deal about that tonight. This has to do essentially with the perceptual changes that people experience while on LSD. The mind becomes flooded with sensations. Some people say they can hear colors and see sounds. Others have mystical or semi-religious experiences. But essentially, it's a highly personalized experience. Apparently, no two people have exactly the same experience. And I think from this psychedelic aspect of LSD have arisen popularized psychedelic art, music, clothing, meaning those that are vivid in color, sound, and design. And from these perceptual changes under LSD also have arisen many of the claims for LSD as an aid-in or a provider of creativity in art and music, problem-solving ability in school and work, design and architecture, etc. There have been three current areas of work with LSD. The first, and one that is unfortunately diminishing, is the research area. That's where the pure LSD is administered to subjects who've been screened by psychiatric interview and psychological testing, and the subjective and objective effects are measured. Objective effects are few, most common being dilated pupils, which is why so many of the teenagers on the Sunset Strip at night are wearing sunglasses. Transient chilliness, flushing of the skin, transient increases in blood pressure, pulse rate, and blood sugar have all been reported. Is LSD addicting? Not physiologically like heroin, no withdrawal symptoms when you stop, but psychically addicting often, meaning once people take it, often they want to continue to take it and will make sacrifices to do so. Is there chronic brain damage from LSD? It's unproven to date that there is chronic brain damage. What we do know is that there are electroencephalographic changes in man and animals on scalp and depth, meaning implanted in the brain depth electrodes, which last from 1 to 2 weeks after a dose of LSD. But again, no chronic brain damage is proven. Is LSD lethal in overdosage? There's no reported evidence of fatality from overdosage from LSD. Second area of interest has to do with LSD in therapy. It's been used, as you've probably heard, with alcoholics to help them stop drinking when all else has failed, in patients dying of cancer, not to reverse the terminal illness, but to help them become less sensitive to pain and die a more dignified death. And it's been used in psychotherapy in general to help people remember early memories. In addition, there are a number of extravagant claims made for the use of LSD in all types of sexual problems: homosexuality, impotence, and frigidity. I think most people would be willing to agree that the final word is not in as far as the efficacy of LSD in therapy. I think more research is desperately needed before we can prove its usefulness in any of these areas, although certainly there are some suggestive possibilities. The third area of interest in LSD, and the one that's my particular area of interest, has to do with that of side effects. At UCLA prior to September of 1965, we were seeing about one problem case associated with LSD every other month. At that time, the incidence began to increase, 5, 10, 20 cases a month. And for every case we saw, 3, 4, or 5 telephone calls from other people in trouble from LSD who did not subsequently come in. We studied the first 70 patients seen. They came in most often with auditory and visual hallucinations, followed by anxiety, often to the point of panic, by depression with suicidal thoughts, some attempt, some severe, and lastly by confusion. The group was predominantly a single white male group with an average age of 21, coming from throughout the Los Angeles area and mostly either unemployed or students. 40% of the group had taken drugs other than LSD within 6 weeks of being seen in the emergency room. 36% were chronic marijuana users, but 40% had never taken drugs other than LSD. Dr. Fisher and I then began to do group therapy on the 25 of the 70 patients that were hospitalized in order to learn a little bit about the acid head, as they call themselves, culture, and the freak out, or freak trip, or bummer, the bad experience from LSD. And from this we went into the community, try and see what was going on there, to observe happenings, as they're called, which included religious rites in Orange County, kick-type parties in Hollywood and Venice, beatnik gatherings in Big Sur, and college students experimenting in the San Francisco area. I'd like at this point to make two special points about the acute bad experience from LSD. First of all, I think it's totally unpredictable who will have a bad experience from LSD or when. Many people, the first time they take the drug, many others have 100 previous good trips before their bad one. Not psychiatric interview, nor psychological testing, nor an absence of symptoms, nor a history of job stability can guarantee immunity from a bad trip. Some of the worst experiences have been in our young residents and doctors at the hospital who volunteered for experiments. Conversely, Dr. Fisher and I have seen some very marginal people who appeared quite ill take what they claim were massive doses of LSD, up to 2,000 micrograms daily for several months without apparent increase in symptomatology. And secondly, you can have reoccurrences of the acute effects in all their original intensity up to a year after you take the drug without ever taking it again. And this is something we're seeing more and more commonly now. People who took the drug had some of the symptoms that were unpleasant, got over them, and then either with stress or without apparent stress, months later began to have the same symptoms again. How do we treat a bad experience? We restrain the person, prevent them from harming themselves or others. We use tranquilizers, Thorazine, a major tranquilizer, which often but not always, in large doses, reverses the effects of the drug. I'd like to make now a comment about set and setting. You hear so much about this. Set the attitude with which you approach your LSD experience, and setting the physical environment in which you take your LSD. And there's a whole LSD mythology that has grown up. It's grown up partly to explain the helpless feelings that people have under the drug and to try to help them find a way to counteract it. And we hear people say that if you're with a guide or a sitter or a babysitter, with one or two good friends, in the right mental attitude, meaning relaxed and not having had a fight with your spouse or boss, if you're in a room with soft lighting, sitting on thick carpeting or a mattress, listening to the Indian music of Ravi Shankar, reading reassuring phrases from the Tibetan Book of the Dead, and have your Thorazine pill next to you, you won't have a bad trip. And this is nonsense. Had our hospital full of people who had all these things going for them, and something happened and they had their bad experience. I don't want to dwell on the deaths, the suicides and the accidental deaths, whose frequency I can't estimate, but which certainly always get a lot of publicity. Homicide and violence is sometimes implicated as being part of the LSD experience, and I don't think that's true at all. I think that's extremely rare. I'd like now to comment on some of the chronic effects from LSD that I've seen in users not only in the hospital but out in the community. First is a dramatic change in value system. Not to say whether it's good or bad, but just that it is a dramatic change. High school and college students dropping out, professionals, business people. I received letters. I've got a letter here that I think illustrates well that I recently received, which I'd like to read to you because it's so typical. Dear Doctor, I'm writing to you for I do not know of anyone else who could give me the advice and information I need. My son, while a student at blank, became a victim of LSD. He was working on his PhD in blank when he gave a seminar on LSD and took large doses himself. Although at the point of completing his research, he quit school, for he no longer felt any need to go on. For over a year, he drifted, living off friends and doing odd jobs, even ditch digging. Then the effect seemed to have worn off some. He said it felt good to have some drive again, and he obtained a job as assistant to the blank in the state of blank. He loved his work, but again began to take LSD and quit his job. He wants to be creative and thinks in about a year he'll know in what field. This is very typical of some of the things we've seen. The second chronic effect has to do with that of perceptual changes. And a good example, and I think examples perhaps best illustrated, would be the manager of a rock and roll band who brought his drummer in to see us with the complaint that since the drummer had begun to take LSD, he could not play very well in the band, nobody could dance to the music, and they were in trouble of going under. When we talked to the drummer, he said that he was playing like Gene Krupa, who was convinced that he was doing superbly. We had dinner with a mathematical engineer who stated that since he began to take LSD, he could solve all kinds of problems. But unfortunately, his employers didn't realize this and they fired him. And he'd been then unable to obtain another job. But he was convinced that the fault was that of the entire industry and not of himself. So again, the common denominator, subjective feelings of improvement with an objective loss of functioning. The next chronic change has to do with the ability to love. Love in the sense of getting outside oneself, of psychic intimacy. And you hear a great deal of talk, you hear a great deal of claims about LSD providing an instant ability to love. We attended a number of love sessions, and it was really interesting. Sometimes the room would be filled with 60 people, all talking at the same time, all having monologues, no one listening to anyone else, but they had the feeling that they were communicating. Afterwards, no one had heard what anyone else had said except what they had said. An even better example, I think, of the application of this was one group we were studying which had, they claimed to have 500 members. One of the members was arrested on a marijuana charge, put in jail on $500 bond. These are 500 working members. They claimed there were 500. I've only seen about 100. But at any rate, these were people who harangued us for hours about their ability to love the world from LSD. The question then came, would they collect $1 apiece and get this person out of jail? And they talked a great deal about this, and they never did it, month after month after month. And we'd go back and ask them about it. And they'd give us long lectures and continue to lecture to us about their ability to love. And there he stayed in jail. I think also we see a tremendous missionary quality where LSD is concerned. We recently hospitalized a young mother at UCLA, not so much because she was having trouble, but because she persisted in giving LSD to her 18-month-old daughter. We've heard the comment made repeatedly, the family that takes LSD together stays together. We talked to one fellow who spent his life savings on LSD and wandered up and down the beaches of Venice and Santa Monica handing it out free to everyone he could. And lastly, I'd like to comment on the appeal of LSD to the young person, the teenager, the college student. And I think this is perhaps the most important, and I think it's certainly the greatest tragedy as far as LSD goes. It's difficult to know why the young person buys what is sold so often about LSD, the instant happiness. Difficult until we think about adolescence, the most difficult time in our lives, the time when we're all struggling to find out who we are, what we want to become, experimenting sexually, trying to handle the sexual feelings, experimenting with anger and rebellion, trying to handle those feelings. And I think what LSD does is create a drugged state whereby persons feel that they have mastered their anger and their sexuality, and I think they're robbed in a very real and very permanent sense from ever working these things out in their formative years. I think with that, I'll stop. Thank you.
I'll take off where Dr. Ungerleider left off with a somewhat different perspective about how I see the current interest in the use of LSD among young people. It's somewhat related to what Dr. Smith this afternoon was talking about in terms of the hazards of a good trip. I think to understand the rapidly increasing drug-taking behavior among young people, and this is particularly true in California, I think it is necessary to adopt a very different context than the one traditionally used. Until recent years, mind-altering drugs, which did not have social approval, have been almost exclusively limited to lower socioeconomic minority groups with a high rate of deviancy in other respects. About the only exception to this was the jazz musician group. Now, it is clear that the young groups who have recently started to use marijuana, LSD, and other drugs are largely from a very different strata. In fact, the Negro, who has always been at the center of the hippie group, apparently has not taken to LSD at all. In the past, a small group went behind locked doors to smoke their pot. They got high, they felt good, and that was it. They certainly didn't emerge with a newfound vision of altering the world. They didn't even attach any special significance to the experience among themselves. They simply smoke pot because they like the feeling. Today, the situation is very different. The drug use is embedded into an ethic which seeks radical social change. I have entitled the attempt to examine this aspect, Psychedelics, Cult or Movement. A cult is definitely limited in either time, as in the case of a fad, or in size. A movement is characterized by rapid growth, the active proselytizing of new members, wide access to the communication media, and it actively competes with the establishment for the allegiance of society's members, particularly the uncommitted youth. In my opinion, the activity of which the psychedelic drugs are a part have more the characteristic of a movement than a cult. It has had and continues to have widespread coverage in the mass communication media, not only the news media, but music, advertising, and other ways. In particular, music seems to be a very active means of spreading the psychedelic values. Many of the top songs that are popular among the young group specifically deal with the drug experience. One that is right at the top at the present time is Acapulco Gold. I believe that's one of the finest qualities of Mexican marijuana available. It goes something like, we're going south to get some Acapulco Gold. Ain't nothing it can't fix. Can teach old dogs new tricks. Where the streets are lined with bricks of Acapulco Gold. There's a number of these type songs. I think they're quite effective. Also, the psychedelic movement, I think, plays a very large role in the rapidly developing underground newspapers, in all of them. The Free Press, the Los Angeles underground newspaper, has increased the circulation from 10,000 to 40,000 in less than a year. And there's now will be the Los Angeles Oracle, which is exclusively devoted to psychedelics, which will be the Los Angeles counterpart of the San Francisco Oracle that has been in existence for some time. Another example is the fact that this conference is meeting here tonight. In short, though small in number as yet, it has had it has a characteristic of a vital movement, and is currently, I think, providing significant competition to the achievement-oriented society as a choice for today's youth, at least here in California. Now, what are the necessary conditions for a movement to start and to flourish? Hallucinogenic drugs are certainly not new. The civilized world was introduced to peyote in around 1900. Weir Mitchell, a well-known physician, in 1896, stated, "I predict a perilous reign of the peyote habit when this agent becomes attainable." And Havelock Ellis joined in, said, "I fully agree there is every likelihood that peyote will become popular." A British medical journal criticized Havelock Ellis for his article entitled "Artificial Paradise," resulting from peyote, saying that it would introduce a lot of people of the public to use this drug. The Literary Digest, 1921, warned of the, quote, "gigantic problem of the spread of peyote to whites," from the Indians. 2 attempts were made to establish peyote cults among Negroes. A Swiss pharmacy embarked in 1933 on a large-scale advertising campaign for peyote, which was, quote, "to restore the individual's balance and calm and," note this, "promote full expansion of his faculties." Mescaline, isolated in 1896 and synthesized in 1919, avoided the nausea produced by peyote. Incidentally, peyote and mescaline are almost identical to LSD in terms of their psychic effects. Meantime, while it was being predicted and warned that this was going to be quite a problem among whites, it never came to pass. But among the Indians, it was another story. They took a census of the Indians in 1919, and 13,000 out of the 316,000 belonged to the so-called peyote cult at that time. 20 years later, it had a membership of 200,000. Half of the peyote of the Indian population belonged to the Native American Church, which uses peyote as a ritual. Now, this is not a cult. This is a genuine movement. When it takes on this size, a movement among the uprooted Indians whose situation at that time, when they were looking for something to call their own, their condition undoubtedly played a large part in the success and the very rapid success of the movement. Several authors have explored the necessary conditions for a movement to flourish. In particular, Eric Hoffer's The True Believer has treated this question, and Kenneth Keniston, in his Uncommitted, while not dealing specifically with movements, has dealt very well with the factor of alienation among today's youth. The factors which are most commonly mentioned is the presence of widespread discontent, and in our present youth, this seems to exist in terms of disenchantment with the materialistic achievement-oriented society. It also requires that leisure time be available. A movement cannot get started where the population is fully devoted to, their time is fully devoted to earning enough for food and shelter. It can't start when a nation is mobilizing for an all-out war effort. A factor in this society that seems to be very important is the fact that this is an affluent society, and this is particularly true for the psychedelic group, who have no viable economic solution, economic way of supporting, or do not outline any method of self-support. Other elements which Keniston has mentioned is the very rapid chronic social change, the resulting lack of historical relatedness, a prolonged period of dependence where when now a youth finishes high school, instead of going into a job or in his father's business or something, he has another either 4 to 8 years of dependence as he attends college. The general weakening of family and community groups contributes. In fact, anything which leaves an individual without an established place to move into in society tends to be a breeding ground for a movement. Now, of course, a movement requires leaders. And in this connection, I think that intellectuals have tended to underestimate Leary for what I think are the wrong reasons. I don't know how many times people have come up to me and said, I went to hear Leary, or I read something Leary said, and I think he's nuts. It just doesn't make any rational sense. But I want to read what Hoffer says in this regard. He says, it is futile to judge the viability of a new movement by the truth of its doctrine and the feasibility of its promises. What has to be judged is the corporate organization for quick and total absorption of the frustrated. And he goes on to say, in terms of the qualities of a leader, their main requirements seem to be audacity and a joy in defiance, an iron will, a fanatical conviction that he is in possession of the one and only truth, faith in his destiny and luck, contempt for the present, a cunning estimate of human nature, a delight in symbols, spectacles, and ceremonials, unbounded brazenness. What counts is the arrogant gesture, the complete disregard of the opinion of others, the single-handed defiance of the world. Charlatanism of some degree is indispensable to effective leadership. There can be no mass movement without some deliberate misrepresentation of the facts. The leader must talk the language of the visionary and the idealist. I think Leary fits these qualities quite well. It is on these grounds... You agree, good. It is on these grounds that one has to evaluate the effectiveness of a movement leader, not on the grounds that it is reasonable and makes rational sense. In fact, as Hoffer points out, the very essence of a movement is the kindling of extravagant hope, the promise of a utopia. Orderly, reasonable, rational, graduated change is not the stuff which movements are made. Now, to bring this up to the present situation, let me quote from Simmons' book, It's Happening, which is a very good description of the current day psychedelic movement. And he describes their goals as follows. The long-term solution among all swingers almost all swingers agree, is to turn the world on. Their dream is to live in a world of beautiful people in which everyone grooves on their own things and doesn't interfere with anyone else in doing it. Where people will say no only because they want to and not because of fear or tie-ups. Where people don't make it their business to screw each other up over some decrepit dogma. Where children aren't stunted by, quote, education and training into growing up absurd, sad caricatures of their possible selves. Well, so much for what facts make for movements and what the qualities of a leader are. What are the satisfactions that a movement offers to the individual? Hoffer strongly emphasizes the gain of losing oneself in the group, the passion for self-renunciation, freedom from decisions, freedom from responsibility, freedom from failure, freedom from freedom. This, and I quote, "The less justified a man is in claiming excellence for his own self, the more ready he is to claim all excellence for his nation, his religion, his race, or his holy cause. Unless a man has the talents to make something of himself, freedom is an irksome burden." There is no doubt that the mass meeting of the faithful in a BM or something of this sort is one of the most exciting experiences possible. Contrast this with the barren aloneness of the differentiated individual. Movements in their active, vital stage are tremendously gratifying. Another characteristic of a movement is the accent on the vague and the mystical. Again, Hoffer has some very pertinent things to say on this. He says, he's talking about the doctrines of a movement. He says, if a doctrine is not unintelligible, it has to be vague. And if it is neither unintelligible nor vague, it has to be unverifiable. When a movement begins to rationalize its doctrine and to make it intelligible, it is a sign that its dynamic span is over, that it's primarily interested in stability. I think this is quite pertinent for the present situation. There is a strong emphasis on the mystical, the parapsychology, ESP, various non-intellectual, non-rational approaches have a particularly, you can't help but be struck by this among the current day psychedelic enthusiasts. There's strong interest in the non-rational, the anti-intellectual approach, the mystical, and so forth. Hoffer points out another aspect, that movements are people who are frustrated, who long to be creative but are frustrated or are failures in their efforts to be creative, are especially attracted to movements. And again, this has a striking parallel in the present movement. This movement is absolutely full of frustrated artists, writers, and so forth, who have not been successful in their creative attempts, but find a satisfactory substitute in the psychedelic movement. Not all, but a very large number of this type are found in the current movement. There is, in a sense, a seeming inconsistence between the rigid dogma advanced by movements and the goal for, as Simmons says, everyone to groove in their own bag. This is, however, a stated end product. The demand of strict adherence to the methods of bringing about such a change are still very evident. Note the condemnation of the cop-out among the psychedelic enthusiasts. The person who believes for a while in the movement but then goes back and starts playing the establishment game. A recent article in the Village Voice about a good article on the Diggers of San Francisco. The Diggers, San Francisco, in the Haight-Ashbury district is a group that daily provides free food for the members of the psychedelic movement. And the quote here is, "Many diggers are vehement in their denunciation of hippies turned merchant, making a profit by selling buttons and psychedelic bric-a-brac. They reject commercialization of hip," end quote. We have here beginnings of revisionist among the psychedelic movement. There is actually a good deal of this purism and hippier-than-thou element in the psychedelic movement, in spite of their stated belief that everyone should be able to go his own way. Well, then, these then are the, I've listed some of the advantages of the movement, the very exciting aspect of belonging to the group, the very definite advantages of escaping self-responsibility and the possibility of failure. What are the disadvantages to the individual? Aside from the hazards of psychosis and other serious personality disruption, which Dr. Ungerleider has described, an obvious problem is that the psychedelic movement is, in fact, totally lacking in any viable economic solution. This is one of the most striking things about the present movement, that this little aspect of reality is simply completely ignored, as though it would somehow go away. There is no suggestion that somehow the members have a responsibility to pull at least their own weight. Many members have an extremely naive vision of moving out to the country where they could be supportive, but no realistic measures are taken. Others have a very distorted and inconsistent notion of the term of dropping out. As Alan Watts recently pointed out, dropping out is not living off of others. That's simply being a parasite. Another disadvantage to the individual is in this joining the movement, joining the group, losing one's individuality. There's a very definite tendency not to develop a discipline in which one can express his own creativity. One can be responsible for his own actions. One can learn to discipline, be creative, learn the satisfactions of achievement. This has gone along with a tendency to escape the brainwashing of the materialistic society, but in doing so, they have lost the perspective of the satisfactions that can come about through personal achievement. And a third disadvantage, as I see it, is this strong emphasis on the mystical and the anti-intellectual, anti-rational approach robs a person of a very indispensable function for simply getting through life. Well, what role then do the psychedelic drugs themselves play in, if there is a movement, in the movement? Psychedelic movement is only one, as I see it, of several developments which are tending in more or less the same direction. I think, although certainly the others have not split from the establishment, sensitivity training, marathon therapy, Synanon, a number of groups are tending in somewhat the same direction that the psychedelic movement is, but the psychedelic movement is more extreme. So it's obvious that drugs aren't necessary to move in this way, and that's been evident for a long time, and many of the Eastern religions have had similar goals to the psychedelic movement and have not used drugs. The stronger psychedelics, that is LSD, mescaline, peyote, psilocybin, however, are, under the proper circumstances, I think, potent modifiers of attitudes, beliefs, and values. They tend to temporarily weaken the existing belief system by broadening the field of alternatives. They suspend habitual patterns of perceiving, and I think it is valid that social and individual inconsistencies do become dramatically apparent, all in the context of a clear sensorium, and new patterns can occur. They're also a highly effective means of producing mystical, oneness, transcendental experiences in a person that is so inclined. For the person who wants to believe, these conversion experiences can be very convincing. They have proved to be highly effective cultogenic agents among many primitive tribes and continue to have some of the same effects in the current movement. Thus, they strongly reinforce the validity of the movement goals. That is, the extravagant hope fostered by the movement is strongly reinforced. Now, I've been talking here in terms of the movement mostly of the relatively small number of people who are aren't actually students. Not too many of our students who are actively in school are intensely involved in the psychedelic movement as I have described it. They tend to be more moderate and they have a foot in both camps. They are, however, influenced by the true hippies, as are many other students who don't take drugs, but are more in sympathy with the love ethos of the psychedelic swingers than they are with the administration's Vietnam policy. The majority of college students are fairly strongly committed to conventional values of the society. We recently finished an experiment in which we recruited subjects, male graduate students, who volunteered simply for a paid experiment without prior knowledge that it was even a drug experiment, let alone LSD. And we did a controlled experiment and tested these subjects with a large battery of tests prior to a series of 3 200 microgram LSD sessions, and then did follow-up testings at periods of 2 weeks and 6 months after the third drug session. Now this is, so we got a fairly random selection of male graduate students, and we did find some changes in the experimental group, but the changes were quite small among this unmotivated group. It was evident that LSD, given under neutral circumstances to an unmotivated random group, would not generally produce very radical changes. We found some slight changes in direction of increased introspection, reflectiveness, less defensiveness, somewhat less materialistically oriented value system, but by and large the changes weren't large enough to be statistically significant. About 4 of the 24 in the experimental group subjectively felt that the drug experiences had had a fairly pronounced effect on their personality of a lasting nature. 10 others thought that it had a more moderate effect, and 10 didn't think it had any effect at all. That was their subjective evaluation. It did turn out that most of them, about 60% of them, felt that it had increased their aesthetic sensitivity to music and art, and in fact this was supported by the fact they bought more records, that is, the experimental group bought more records, went to more art museums, attended more musical events. It was, in this sense, a sort of an aesthetic head start for artistically deprived adults. One thing that we didn't find very strong changes, before and after changes, we did find very clear personality correlates which went along with interest in, response to, and reports of lasting effect to taking LSD. This was very clear-cut, and we could predict with a test pretty accurately this interest and response and reports of after effect. The strongly structured person, the person who likes his life well structured and planned and so forth, is simply not interested in taking LSD, won't respond much if you do give it to him, and won't think that it did anything for him afterwards. The person who is interested responds intensely and finds the experience beneficial, tends to be a more casual person who likes a spontaneous life, does not like structure. Well, so much for our experiment. It seems that among persons who are susceptible to its effect, we can say a little something about what the lasting personality changes are likely to be. It does tend, it appears, to produce more emotional lability, wider mood swings. These are lasting effects, at least up to 6 months. It increases aesthetic satisfaction, but there was no evidence in our experiment of any increase in aesthetic ability, a sensitivity, in the art tests that we gave, and also no evidence of increased creativity. Subjects seem to be less influenced by cultural goals and values, particularly ones for which they see no valid reason themselves, and particularly a lessening of achievement-oriented values, materialism, and a tendency towards greater introspection and reflectivity. Well, that's all I will say about our experiment. And in summary, I've argued that the present-day use of psychedelic drugs must be understood in the context of an accompanying movement. I've noted some of the factors that seem to favor a movement and seem to be present now and accounting for the existence of the current movement. And I've pointed out some of the satisfactions and disadvantages to the individual. My main point is, however, that there's a world of difference between the pattern of drug use by minority groups a few years ago, when pot was smoked only because it made you feel good, and an occasional adventuresome student took peyote and found it very interesting but otherwise unrelated experience. There's a world of difference between that and the present situation where psychedelics are intimately associated with 3-day celebrations, 10,000 person BNs, much of popular music, all the underground newspapers, and a rapidly growing movement with a strong anti-establishment philosophy. Thank you.
That's a good one.
Now we'll hear from Dr. Alpert.
This is the fifth of these meetings that I have had the opportunity to attend, and I've debated against or presented material on the same platform with a number of opponents who have at various times described the possibilities of gangrene setting in from ergot poisoning, badly produced black market LSD, of various kinds of brain damage. Tonight, I heard about changes in value systems, perceptual changes, the problems about the ability to love, the missionary qualities. Now, I am in a peculiar position when I listen to all of these things because I have been taking a lot of these drugs. In fact, I've taken one psychedelic or another of the major ones besides marijuana over 300 times. And I am constantly looking for signs of gangrene and for signs of pathology and for signs of social, sexual, intellectual pathology. And I realize that a lot of the effectiveness of my whatever statements I make is simply to come around and be sane. That all I've got to do is stand up and say, ladies and gentlemen, as I said to the committee, the legislative committee for the state of California investigating drugs, gentlemen, I've taken these drugs all these times, and I present myself to you as somebody who has not taken them primarily for kicks, although they are great fun, has not taken them primarily because I'm sick, although I'm sure I have as much neurosis as the next fellow. And I would like to ask you, gentlemen, whether it would be possible for you to recognize my existence. Because in your laws you have, I'm talking to legislators now, not you. In your laws, you have categories only for two groups of people who use drugs in the United States. Either you take it because you're sick, and then a doctor should prescribe it, or you take it because you're sick in the other sense, that is, because you want kicks. And then the narcotics division should take it over. Now, could it be possible that a person like me could exist? Let's first ask that question. Could somebody who uses these chemicals because he thinks they are educational, he thinks they have something to do with man's potential and his use of his brain, he thinks they have something to do with man's spiritual base, he thinks even in his grandiosity that it has something perhaps even to do with man's evolution. Could such a guy exist, and could he be anything but crazy? I had that interesting moment when I had been fired from Harvard, for working with LSD. And there was a press conference, and the TV cameras and newspaper men were all standing there. Now, my parents had disowned me. Harvard had made a public statement. I was the worst person. You realize I was the first person thrown out of Harvard in at least 6,000 years. I had worked very hard to get that appointment. I'd gone through Stanford and been at Harvard for 5 years, had the promise of a permanency, had my whole scene set up, NIMH grants and all. And I stood up there and I waited to feel the feeling of shame, of guilt, somehow that I was a bad boy. And everybody looked at me with that pained look of suffering. But the trouble was, when I looked inside, I felt okay. Now, you see how scary that is. That's why you say people that take the drugs are no longer objective to study them. Because Dr. Ungerleider is absolutely right. There are changes in values. Believe me, before I took psychedelics, I could not have stood up in that situation of total social condemnation and felt other than all of the anxiety symptoms that were so familiar to me. And I said to myself, wow, do you suppose you've become a total psychopath? I mean, here you are, you're not having any deep affect. Why aren't you feeling guilty? You're Jewish, you believe in Freud. Why aren't you feeling all those feelings? Where are they? It's like when my mother died 5 weeks ago. I went through the death in as conscious a way as I knew how, and I didn't feel grief, because death meant something very different to me than it had before. And I looked at myself and I said, where's your grief reaction? You know what happens to people that don't have grief reactions. Now, I asked myself at the time, do you suppose you become a psychopath? And I want to ask the questions even a little more intensely and tell you that you're dealing here with, we are dealing here with a problem of shifts in social perception and social values that cannot be treated as we have treated other adolescent acting out type behaviors. I was at a meeting in the Hollywood Hills last year in which there were a group of parents on one side and a group of their 15-year-old children on the other side who were using LSD. And one of the parents had written to me and said, our children respect you, would you come to this meeting? And I was delighted to come to such a meeting. And the meeting went on for a number of hours, but the key remarks in my head were one line when the mother said to her son, Jimmy, you're just not like an adolescent is supposed to be. And she looked at me and she says, do you realize my son even wants me to take LSD with him? She says, in some funny way, he's too nice. He's too nice. Another mother in Toronto said to me 2 weeks ago on the phone, when I looked into my son's eyes, I remembered when I was a young person and was rebelling, and I remember that feeling of rebellion, and I remember that when my parents looked at me, they knew I was rebelling. They could see it in my eyes, and they knew I'd come around because I really shared their values. She said, I look in my son's eyes, and it's like I'm seeing somebody from a different culture. And I don't have that feeling inside myself that he'll come around. Now, I can follow a number of strategies in these meetings. I can be scientific and erudite to show you that my mind still works and try to compete with the erudition we've already had. But I think that the gentlemen that have presented tonight have done a darn good job of presenting the breadth of the issue, although their perspective may be somewhat different from my own. I sit around and wonder, when I wonder what's going to happen with psychedelics, what Western technological society is going to do when it has 100,000 18-year-old Buddhas hanging around with begging bowls. And I say to the psychiatrist, gentlemen, if you really want to deal with the LSD problem of the bad reaction, you might for a moment get over your pomposity of assuming that you know how to deal with this matter and respect the possibility that some of us that have been experimenting all this time on ourselves and with each other might know something. And our recommendation has been that you take one wing of any psychiatric unit, such as the one that Dr. Ungerleider runs, and set it up as a meditation ashram. And we will provide all of the guidance, and we'll take over the LSD problem, because it should be a do-it-yourself thing. A few weeks ago, I was lying in my bathtub around 2 in the morning, and the phone rang. And I was in New York, and this girl said, my brother is having a very bad reaction to LSD. She was in San Mateo, California. And I've called the family doctor, and now I wanted to call you and see what you could do about it. Well, where is he? Oh, he's in the bathtub. Well, that seemed to be a marriage made in heaven. And the phone reached, and so pretty soon he was, I said, well, put him on. Hello? Hello? What's happening, man? It's awful. It's awful. I'm going to do something terrible. Oh, you are? I mean, I know I'm going to hurt myself or somebody else. Well, if you know that, then there's no sense in talking about it. Well, I'll tell you, man, I'm going crazy. Oh, you're going crazy? Well, are you crazy or aren't you crazy? I mean, it's important to me to know because I can hear what you're saying and you can hear me. So I'd like to know, are we crazy or aren't we? Because we seem to be in contact. Well, I'm about to go crazy. Oh, well, let's talk until you decide to go crazy, okay? Right. I'm no good. Oh, how are you no good? Well, and so on. And the conversation went on for quite a while, and I asked him if he had a candle available, and he did, and I asked him if he would light it, and he did, and we both lay in our bathtubs with our candles at opposite ends of the country, and we meditated on the candle, and on the flame, and on life, and the process of life, and on where human hang-ups really were, and how neurosis was kind of a drag. And at one point he said, this is costing a lot of money. And I said, well, after 9 o'clock, it's only $1 for every 3 minutes. And actually, it's costing less than a good psychiatrist would cost. Well, we talked for 50 minutes, which seemed like a traditional amount of time. And we laughed very hard. And when I told this story once on the platform with Sidney Cohen, who's one of my usual partners in these shows, he said, well, very often it's possible to talk people down. And I said, down? Why, I was so high when I finished that conversation, I couldn't even get out of the tub. Well, the interesting part about that story was the girl wrote me a letter, and she said they sat by the fire and talked afterwards about life and all of the things that affect social values and perception. But she said while the phone conversation was going on, the doorbell rang, and it was a doctor. And it turned out that the answering service for their doctor had called another doctor, and he was standing at the door to help, and behind him was standing a policeman. And the doctor's opening line was, I understand there is an LSD psychopath loose here. Now, that story starts a little bit to reflect not only different therapeutic strategies, but different ways of perceiving of what we're talking about. Because if I sat through everything you've sat through for the past day, I would wonder why anybody in their right mind would ever even consider taking LSD. Because it's been considered a problem and something that leads to the breakdown of all that's good, apparently. Let me take the few remaining minutes I have to give you a little feeling of what it's like to take LSD and why a guy like me would take it. You've heard numerous references to the fact that it alters your senses, color, taste, and so on. That all sounds fine in a cold, objective sense, but the table divides here. There, on that side is objectivity, on this side is subjectivity. Okay? On that side is the best that social science can do, really, at this moment to deal objectively within the category systems available to us with human experience. We can measure it sociologically, we can give tests, we can make observations. On this side of that dividing line is straight subjective experiential reporting. It has seemed to me that when Watson came in 1913, we very quickly threw the baby out with the bath in social science. When introspectionism went out, we lost the capacity to respect the individual's ability to tell us about his own experiences and use the data as other than merely a set of symbols coming out of his mouth. Now let me characterize one of the problems we experiential people have with you behaviorist people. I was a subject in an experiment, and sitting next to me was a psychiatrist with a pad of paper. And he asked me, "Can you tell me what is happening now?" It's a very reasonable human question to ask in the middle of a session. Can you tell me what is happening now? Now, what was happening to me at that moment? Well, let me give you a little bit of a cut-up of it, since it was cut up. I was experiencing a feeling as if I were coming from a watery medium into an air medium. Now, that might be ontogeny, and it might be phylogeny, and it might be hallucination. But it was very powerful, very profound. And it was like I was breathing for the first time. And it was had that feeling of freshness to it. At the same moment, since that whole thing was taking place in kind of a peculiar body angle, I had an association to a roller coaster, which I was then also on, upside down. Furthermore, some of the colors of the reddish, bluish things in my field reminded me of an impressionist painting I had seen in Paris. And I was inside that painting at that same moment, and in that museum. And furthermore, all of this was with my eyes open, during which I was looking at the psychiatrist, who looked very much like a lobster. Now, all of that happened to me, trivial or whatever you want to call it, all of that happened during the time he said the word "can." Okay? Then he said the word "you." See, he's going to say, "Can you tell me what's happening to you now?" Say, "You." Well, "you" takes like, at least 20 years to say. And you hear you, and you hear you. Who's you? You. What a strange, a you, an animal, you. And you keep going through association after association after association. Literally hundreds and hundreds of associations simultaneously now. Now, there is a perfectly plausible, although all of the neurological theorizing we do is baloney, and it really is metaphor building at the moment from what we know about the nervous system. But there's a pretty good one going around that says that LSD affects the synapses in the nervous system, the little chemical joining boxes between nerve fibers. And that between any two nerve fibers, you've got one fiber coming in and the possibility of up to 20,000 fibers coming out of that synapse. And it's a chemical bond, and the chemistry of that synapse determines which of those fires. So through learning changes chemistry. One comes in, one goes out. This is oversimplified, as most of you know, but it's all right. Now imagine you change the chemistry of that little synapse along with all the others in the brain, so that every time this one comes in, all 20,000 of those fire. And not only do all 20,000 of those fire, but you experience all 20,000 of those. Not only that, but you experience it as if you were experiencing the 20,000 things in their direct relationship to one another. And you say, everything is related to everything else. Wow. Okay. Now, all of that's happening at the experiential level. That's back in here somewhere, or wherever that is. Maybe it's in the pineal gland, who knows. To bring it out, you have to conceptualize it. You have to take what your 13 billion cell brain is producing, and you have to stick that through a grid which has 10,000 concepts in it and allows you to conceptualize at the rate of 3 concepts a second. Right? And in order for me to slow down enough to tell that psychiatrist what was happening to me at that moment, just would have been such a Herculean task, and beyond which it didn't make me, I didn't want to do it particularly. And how could I even begin to tell him? If I tried to tell him, I'd say, well, and the word well would start me on a whole train of experiential associations. So I just looked at him aghast, and I didn't say anything, and he wrote something down, and the next day I looked at his pad, and it said on it, catatonic, right? Now, in fact, I was catatonic. There's no doubt about it. I just sat there like a goof looking at him. What I'm perplexed by is, what am I, as just one human being, forget whether I'm a social scientist or anything any longer, what am I going to do with my own experiences? Am I going to label them in terms of other people's models of mankind? You see, the thing that's in addition perplexing me, besides the power, the validity, the subjective intensity of these experiences, and I just gave you one about speed of association, is the parallel and the repetitive way in which reports of these kinds of experiences by man appear through the written literature of mankind. They're called visionaries, they're called mystics. The Eastern world is full of people who have explored their own consciousness. Now, the reason I have to say all this to you is because if you are going to be at all effective in dealing with your students, you have to at least know what they're thinking about. And they're thinking a lot of the same kinds of things I'm thinking. That we don't really know yet whether this is a payoff. We all know we're taking risk. We all know we're explorers. But it is subjectively providing us with an experience that suggests the possibility for man to move to another level of consciousness. That's too far out. Let me try it a simpler way. It is showing us perhaps that there are ways of conceptualizing of man's mind that are other than those suggested by Freud. And that such ways of conceptualizing may be more productive in behavior change and creativity and so on. It seems to me that when we are ignorant as we are, and when some of our fellow human beings come along and say they are exploring something that is new, we should be very, very reticent about imposing our existing concepts on the experience. You see, I don't feel like I am outside of society. I feel that a healthy society always has in it the elements of change as well as the elements of stability. It always has in it the priests and it has the visionaries. It always has the static and it has the flux. And I see that we that are exploring consciousness through our own inner beings are doing no more than developing another leading edge for man to know whether he can indeed know more. The way has been laid out very, very beautifully by many historical writings. Now, it's true that Westerners, some 40,000 years ago, got very, what I call prehensile fixation. They got very attached to what they could manipulate and what was outside. And they built an extraordinary technology. And that technology has left all of us physically healthy, but very much externalized as human beings, with very little to fall back on inside. And there is, see, I don't think that LSD is the thing. LSD seems to me to merely be a symptom, perhaps, or a part of an awareness that grows on people, and who can it grow on best but the young people who don't have the commitment to the establishment. A growing awareness that it doesn't pay off, that that external game wasn't enough. I look around at my father and I see he's got his new Cadillac and he's got his home in the country and he's got status and he's got a great reputation, and that man feels miserable. And I look and I talk to these kids, and what they say is, who wants it, man? Lyndon Johnson's not my hero figure. McNamara isn't my identification figure. What happened to the humanness in people? You see? That's what human be-ins are about. They are a statement that people are trying to make of, we will just come together to be together. We're not going to do anything. Enough people have been doing enough for long enough. What we have to do is reestablish our basic humanity first. Now, it may turn out that the psychedelics provide a chemical means by which Westerners who have developed such a very effective socialization process that they hand on from parent to child to parent to child, a process which we developed some 40,000 years ago to allow us to survive, which is the survival model of competition, and the Protestant ethic came along later. And that model, which we've gotten so good at passing on, may be that we've gotten to the point now in this society where it's time to chemically look again, chemically break through that model for a moment and see once again where man is at. I don't question for a moment that these experiences are disruptive. They are much more disruptive than these lectures are giving you to believe. The dropout rate goes up, and it will continue to go up. And I think the only realistic thing you're going to be able to do is consider the possibility that the young people are going to require what you would call a moratorium. That is a period of time when they won't be all involved in getting ahead. They'll spend some time re-looking back inside, re-looking at the whole relation of themselves to the universe once again. And it may well be that that moratorium will take 3 years. I've suggested to the hippies that if they want to have a state-supported chance to go become a religious intoxicant, the best thing to do is to flip out and go to a mental hospital. People take care of you. They'll feed you and clothe you and provide a place for you to sleep, and you can study Tibetan or whatever you want to study. And you're very smart. If you're conscious, you know how to play with a psychiatrist so that they think you're getting better and they don't shock you or tranquilize you or lobotomize you or whatever else they do. See, I keep wanting to say it stronger and then tempering it because I want to say psychiatrists aren't where I look to know about my human consciousness, because I don't think they know any more than anybody else does about it. And I think they're putting themselves in the place of medicine men in the society is pompous, to say the least. And when it gets to the place where Aldous Huxley, I remember, said to me, Richard, isn't it extraordinary? I have to frequent the black market in order to be able to go on with my explorations. Now, there are a lot of us. And many of us, really think there is something here. We really think we are tuning in to something about man's consciousness that mankind really needs to know. And we're not interested in whether you say we can do it or we can't do it, unfortunately. Because we're going to do it anyway. Because I don't see anything else I have to do in life that's 1/10 as important as that. It's like the Confessions of a Junkie. Right? And you can interpret it as you will. But you do have me out here. And some 100,000 of me, I guess. And they come in all ages and ranges. And out of the mouths of 15-year-olds, when you can get over your horror of a 15-year-old taking drugs, you listen, and through a lot of the nonsense also comes some profundities that you don't get many often from yourself. It's hard to know where a change would first become manifest in a society, but be wary of writing it off too quickly. Thank you.
Thank you, gentlemen, for your presentations. The floor is open for questions. Yes?
I'd like to ask Dr. Alpert, what do you think of the fact that...
This is an interesting place, an Eastern consciousness study is. About 90% of the Eastern mystics are probably phony, and the other 10% are probably really know something. And of those 10%, I'd say they split pretty well as to whether they, well, the issue is presented pretty well, I think, in that Time article called Instant Mysticism, where one of the Western theologians said, these gentlemen are trying to make an end run around Christ and go directly to the Holy Ghost. And the other group said, what difference does it make as long as they make it? You see? And there are Easterners who say, look, don't get trapped in the way, even the way of following a master. What you have to do is trust your inner being and listen and be careful, especially when you get to like 4th level occult powers and so on. Other Easterners say, it is very risky for you to do it on your own. You need a master, and here I am. Or here is somebody else to work with. My feeling is we need all the help we can get, but we are in a unique position in this world at this moment, and I don't think any of us are turning off that possibility. I myself am about to drop out, literally, and leave now for 6 months study in India, in which I'm really looking. I'm on what's known, as Allen Ginsberg's put it, I'm on the holy man circuit. You know, I'm going around meeting holy men. Now, last year, I stopped taking LSD for 6 months at the request of an Eastern mystic who said to me that this was no more like the true reality than a mirage was to water. And I meditated on this for 6 months, and at the end of that time, I made the decision that I couldn't reject my inner feelings, and there was nothing in my inner feelings that told me that I should stop. And that I, as a Westerner, did not have sufficient capacity to believe somebody else. I had to know it for myself. And that's one of the problems for Westerners, you see, because Westerners can't buy the Eastern model of following a master.
Excuse me, but I thought that earlier you were criticizing the West for not being responsive enough to Eastern...
I think, as I said, I think we need all the maps and helps and guides we can get, and mainly they do come from the East. But I think one must weigh the information one gets and make one's own individual decision. That's... You mean now? Did it all seem that random? I guess it did. You mean during a session?
Well, maybe during a session, no.
I'm like this all the time, except I've got a cold, a very bad cold. Actually, during the first initial experiences, there is tremendous panic because of the newness of the experience. For example, when you first start to externally hallucinate, and you hallucinate the disappearance of your own body, it frightens people. You know, when you see your legs melt away, most people get scared they're going to die. And during the first experience, so much is happening so fast that any attempt to direct it is usually pretty dismal. other than just getting the person to relax and go with the experience. Because often they get to something that's so beautiful, they say, oh, it's so beautiful, I want to stay here forever. And in the first session, you usually agree in front, look, go the whole circuit. You know, you can come back to that some other time, all right? Now, later on, you can start to program sessions, and that's what becomes most interesting to me, because if indeed what you're really doing is re-examining whole clusters of your habits of association and perception under psychedelics, which is like under some kind of a microscope, then you use artifacts in the session to bring you to those particular areas to think about. So you might have a sexual session, you might have a session concerning achievement, you might have a session concerning politics and human relationships, communities, so on. In other words, you re-examine all of your basic associations in any area by, in the middle of the session, having either through a guide or through pictures or through objects, artifacts of some kind or another, they suggest to you a train of association. You are very suggestible in that sense, not in the sense that somebody can take your mind somewhere, but they can start a train of thought for you anyway. Right?
Question here.
Dr. Alpert, when you were talking about coming from a watery existence and free air, it suggested to me something like a rebirth type situation coming from the womb, the air of life. And then you talked about the psychiatrist being a lobster, and I was just wondering, I don't know which trip this was that you were on. What if you don't realize what you're doing? And is that in, quote, reality? Is that reality if you can't associate what is real with what is going on right now? It seemed like you talked about word associations and you meaning all types of things. I can't visualize a reality in this.
Well, reality is really pretty, it is almost impossible to discuss what reality is because we work from different realities to do it. And if I were to define what I see the true reality was, it was the comprehension of the many realities, all of which are quite equally real, you see. In other words, I can stand up here and say, what absolute nonsense my standing up here and talking. Or I can go to another level and say, well, look at him, he's earning a living. Or I can say, well, this is a socially responsible thing to be doing. Right? I mean, those are all levels of looking at this thing. Or I can look out and see you all as energy patterns, you know, and just turn you off as human beings. Because you are all energy patterns, after all. And so are the chairs, and I can see you in the chairs and patterns within patterns. Is that nuts, or am I really seeing it? You know, is that reality? It's also reality. You know? See, it seems to me that one of the things that happens is an increase in a shift from a single-dimension temporal consciousness, where you follow one track of thought over time, relating it to the past and the future, and stay at one level of consciousness within the game usually, so you're caught within the thing you're doing, to a spatial relationship where at every moment you experience a multi-level of consciousness simultaneously, and it just keeps going on and on and on and on like that. See? Now, I don't believe that the psychiatrist is a lobster, right? But I do believe he probably has some qualities like one, and that maybe his coloring suggested one to me for that moment, and that was coming and coming and coming and coming. Now, the question is, will I behaviorally act on my hallucinations? Behaviorally, the only time people act is when they really panic, and then mainly they're reacting to their panic and trying to get out of the panic. And sometimes the panic will take the form of the hallucination, and they'll try to avoid the hallucination. Usually the panic reactions are panic because it's happening too fast and they want to stop it. That's the main kind of panic that I think presents itself at Bellevue. Most kids that take LSD are able at some level or other, because I've never found, I couldn't make contact with one ever in the past 5 years of thousands of them, panicked calling me, that they all know at some level or other exactly what they're doing, you see. And I always respect that in another human being. To me, there isn't anybody that's crazy in that sense. See, it's only that I can't find where they're at, maybe. That's my problem. Right?
Dr. Smith.
Dr. McGlothlin, I wonder if you comment on an observation that as the psychedelic community develops more of a collective identity, it's so in the scenes of their own undoing, identity problems are involved with individuals as they together in a collective identity. I think this will eventually disperse the group, perhaps.
I'm glad you asked me a question. Beginning well, I think movements have very definite stages, and that the present psychedelic movement, as I see it as a movement in California anyway, is in its very vital growing stages. And if it does prove viable, if it does come up with some reasonable economic solution, if it continues to grow, it would probably stabilize and become adaptive. I think that, as I pointed out, that the individual does give up quite a bit when he joins a group and gives up his individual identity, and this is not the direction which I want to go, nor actually do I have a free choice to go. But I certainly recognize that for many people it has very distinct satisfactions, and that the opposite differentiated individual is a sort of lonely, barren road. I don't know in terms of sowing the seeds of its own destruction. It seems to me it just is, like Christianity or any other movement.
Question here.
Dr. Alpert gives the impression that the only young people today who are questioning the establishment are those that are drugged. And I wonder if the panel could discuss the young people in general today, and if maybe they are, in general, a questioning generation that is trying to examine what's happening to the value of society, and it's not only those that are drugged that are questioning.
Who would like to comment on that?
Well, I think the implication has been that if you're a questioning adolescent, you're on drugs, and I think this is certainly not true. I think the adolescents are questioning in many ways, and our hope is that they'll question, and I would say even rebel, because I think out of rebellion can come a great deal, not only for them individually, but for society. They keep adults on their toes. But I hope that they'll rebel in a non-drugged state, or at least in a state where they don't harm themselves. And I've tried to point out why I feel they do harm themselves, which makes me reflect, too, isn't adolescence a fantastic time? Isn't it? It's so filled with paradoxes. Here, the adolescent, on the one hand, can see through so much that's bad, if you will, in our adult society, the materialism, the bomb, Vietnam, our fantastic laws on abortions, marijuana, our entire sexual attitudes. They can see through all these things and prick our conscience. And on the other hand, the opposite. They become so susceptible to the seductive, Pied Piper-ish kinds of things that one is hearing about the magic through the drug, the magic of finding the answer. It's very fascinating to me, this time of adolescence.
Dr. Ungerleider, would you agree, however, that your perspective and view, perhaps just as subjective or personal or slanted in terms of the perspective that Dr. Alpert did, in view of the fact that your experiments or your research is geared almost totally to one segment of the population, that is the bad trip individual, without having controls, and in a sense, the reality that you see perhaps is as objective as an experimenter who would have had the controls.
That's a good question, and certainly the hospital group represents what you might call the freeway accidents. And that's why Dr. Fisher and I spent so much time out in the community observing people who were not seeking psychiatric or medical help or any kind of help, but who claimed to be quite happy. So that I would not like to leave the impression that most of our observations were based only on the hospital population. That's not true at all.
Question back here.
You read us a letter by father of a man. Do you know whether the man took LSD for a long time?
Mother. No, I know just what the contents of the letter were. Saying that maybe maybe the son wasn't on LSD at all. That's right. I'm presenting it to you as an observation of what I'm seeing and what I do see a great deal. Now, it's true, and you might also say, how do we know when somebody comes into an emergency room and says, I'm having a bad trip from LSD? How do we, in fact, know that he is having a bad trip from LSD? You can't measure it chemically once it's inside the body. How does one know? We can't stop and get a sample from him and send it back to Washington and wait 2 weeks to find out. But I think there are certain perceptual changes that people experience when they're on LSD. Just like all the samples we've had that we've taken randomly to find out how much people were getting on the black market and thought they were getting. In no case could they tell how much they were getting, but in every case, when they said they were taking LSD, they were taking LSD. I think there's certain fairly characteristic kinds of perceptual changes that would help us to believe this.
Our time is for a couple more questions, and then ask each panelist if you would care to make any closing statement. Maybe there's a question in the back here.
Would I, from my monumental ego, comment on the effects of LSD on the ego? I think the word ego is very complex, but let me try it another way. That we know ourselves in two ways. We know ourselves as I, that is, as subject, and we also know ourselves as me, that is, as object, and we know ourselves in terms of our phenomenal field of my hand, my body. That's all object, the way we look at it, from some scanning device or subjective point. Now, LSD tends to break through any static way of looking at anything and showing you many ways of seeing the same thing, so that any attempt to formally define the me or object starts to become just absurdly oversimplified. And one experiences the fluidity of definition of self as well as of other. The hallucination part of it is looking at, say, a woman's face and seeing every woman one has ever known, every even abstract aspect of womanness in each woman. Now, with this kind of a breakdown in definition for a moment, one has a chance to take a look again at, quote, who one is in the object sense. And furthermore, since in that question before about psychologically dying or the feeling of death and rebirth, there is a feeling that for a moment the I is quite free of all of those objective aspects of self. From that vantage point, one sees that a lot of what is defined as self in object terms is changeable, and is changeable by the individual himself. That would mean his habits and his way of relating to the environment. Such a new perception, it would be quite silly for us to expect it not to have a most dramatic effect on an individual. I ask each of you to think back to some point in your life where you stopped doing long enough, stopped rushing ahead towards some goal out there long enough to re-examine exactly where you were at, what it was all about, reviewed the basic questions of who am I, where did I come from, where am I going, who is my brother, all of the basic questions to which religion addresses itself.